additional events and services. God is trusting us to harness the wealth of all He has poured out over the last 10 years to build systems that discover, deploy, debrief, and develop a tribe of gifted individuals. The move of God is moving from the pew to the pulpit. The job of clergy in this season is to be Mordecai. Train, release, debrief, and cover Esthers. And I began to see some strange manifestations of God's glory upon the life of His people. God beginning to raise and send those from among us into the higher echelons of power in the political space, in the media space, in the government space, in the financial space. Men and women who are prophets, apostles, pastors, evangelists, and teachers in their own right. People with dreams and visions, not necessarily to serve the vision of a church, but to be part of a church that serves their vision. I repeat, in this season, God is not calling men and women to serve the vision of ministries. God is raising ministries to serve the visions that He has put in the hearts and minds of His people. God is raising a Joseph generation. And God began to speak to me about the man or the men Joseph. Two men, same assignment from two different perspectives. The first Joseph was the Joseph in Egypt who was a 17-year-old when he had a dream where the sun, the moon, and the stars were going to bow to him. And when he got to 30, he realized the context in which the sun, the moon, and the stars would bow would be him serving their destiny by going ahead of them to create a system that fed them in a time of famine. We see a prophetic office that is so mature that it can be in a prison and still minister to the needs and the dealings of a butler and a baker and send them to a palace. We see a capacity so strong that an entire household of one of the foremost officers in Pharaoh's guard, Potiphar, could be left in the hands of a Hebrew, a stranger, who at that time couldn't have been more than 20 years old. We see a man with the capacity to govern the world's first superpower, Egypt, yet so anointed in the prophetic that he could foresee a famine 7 years in advance. And we also see a man who is young enough to be Reuben's son, but old enough to be Ephraim and Manasseh's father, a connector of destinies, one who understood that his entire purpose in life was to be a platform for others to be built on. And finally, we see a man who even in his death said, make sure you pick up my bones. Bones speak about structure. They speak about constructs of strategic arrangements for the system of God. And we see a man who even in his death, when he is off the scene, has left a system and a structure which becomes a rallying point for a generation years after him. The second Joseph is of even more interesting. Of course, we know that the first Joseph, I should add, went through a season of trial and tribulation and pain, and went through a season of lurching from one calamity to another. And the Lord kept saying that God was with him. And I heard the Lord clearly speak to me and say, Lord, even in this last decade, where it seemed there was one fire after the other, I have been with you. In the pit with you, in Potiphar's house with you, in the prison with you, and make sure that when you get to the palace, you don't forget to take me with you. The second Joseph is an interesting man. This is a man with such capacity that God could trust him to be the foster parent to his own son. God is raising a generation of Josephs who can look after the pregnant system of God's bride and not touch her. I repeat, God is raising a generation of spiritual leaders who can cover, lead, prophetically listen for instructions for the safety of his bride and his son, what he is birthing, and not touch her. First of all, when God called Mary and told her to bear Jesus, he didn't violate protocol. He spoke to Joseph himself. And God is calling for a generation of leaders who he can whisper in the ear concerning what he's dealing with his people in the secret place. Speak to Joseph to deliver Jesus from Herod by taking him into Egypt. Speak to Joseph to go to Bethlehem, but trust him not to touch Mary. Too many moves of God have been violated by the DNA of human leadership. God has called us to lead, not to impregnate his bride. And finally, concerning our house, in this season, there is about to be a very interesting level of spiritual prophetic activity. I'm talking dreams, visions, encounters, supernatural activity, healings, deliverances, spontaneous gatherings, unplanned, 2 or 3 people in a house, and 4 days later there's a crowd. Healings on the street, healings on the bus, but specifically, and I want to pay special attention to this, specifically a frightening capacity for wealth creation. And I'm not talking about mammon. I was in the spirit on this particular day, or a particular week, and there were 2 specific demonic entities the Lord showed me. One was the spirit of fear, and it was a bird-like runner. Of course, we understand prophetically what God shows to one person may be different from what he shows to another. I'm not preaching theologically that the spirit of fear is always a bird. I'm just saying what I saw. There was this bird-like creature that was several meters wide. And when it began to flap its wings, this cold chill, paralytic terror began to come upon me and the people in the environment. The second spirit I saw was a spirit of mammon. And I don't want to take the time to define what that one looked like, because I literally have no reference point in the natural to describe. The best I could talk about it was it looked like a sea monster. And I asked God, why are you showing me these 2 things? And the response was, you can tell what I'm doing by what the enemy is fighting with. If the enemy has deployed fear and mammon, it tells us that God is calling for faith and supernatural wealth creation. There is going to be a frightening level of faith available to those who tap in this season. And not just for wealth creation, I'm coming to that in a second. Visions, dreams, and plans which God will speak to you, which in the last decade will have paralyzed you with fear about where to start. There is a strong spirit of faith being released. And if you will say yes, you'll see doors open spectacularly and supernaturally. Concerning finance, we've heard it talked about for so long about a wealth transfer. And many have preached about how the wealth of the sinners come into the righteous. And many of you have been sat down in your homes praying, waiting for unbelievers to go bankrupt so you can pick up their money. That's not how it's going to work. But God is raising an anointing in this season. A Jacob kind of anointing where Laban will say, you spoiled me. We're going to engage the Labanic system of the world with scriptural, biblical, prophetic insight and strategies. And no matter how many times they try to change our wages, there will be heaven's grace every time to walk away with the profit. Specifically, and this excites me, we've been doing a series about time from the end of December into the beginning of January. And the last day of the year, or the last message of the year about that was concerning redeeming the time. How God says when we look back on the past, He doesn't restore what we lost, He restores time. Because time is the Spirit's currency. God doesn't look at stuff. He doesn't look at even opportunities or what could have been. He looks at the season of time that He bequeaths us to transact for heaven's will. And God says He's restoring time, correcting mistakes, giving an opportunity to go over certain things. And two prophetic metaphors come to play. The first is the metaphor of Zechariah and John.